This is getting well out of hand. How am I supposed to fix this?
Welcome back to Backyard Ballistics, by the way.
So apparently, this pile of rust used to be a World War II era M3, also known as grease gun, the cheap, mass-produced submachine gun that was supposed to replace expensive Thompson in US service towards the end of World War II. But that's all I know for now. Instead, I've got a lot of questions. Is there going to be some solid metal inside? Is there anything worth salvaging inside? And most importantly, how am I going to get it out?
And there's one question you should be asking yourself, and you should ask it anytime you're watching a video like this. Is this rust fake? Because it's so much that it kind of looks like it, but I can prove you it's not.
Firstly, look at this lump that crumbled away. This flaky look is typical of the corrosion of coarse-grained laminated steel, which is just what the M3 was made out of. Also, here I'm dipping some rust in concentrated hydrochloric acid, where it immediately starts dissolving, giving the solution a bright orange color, the color of ferric chloride, which is just what we'd expect from dissolving rust. The rusting is genuine, which is good news for you, not so much for me. You know, real rust is much harder to get rid of than the fake one. See, at first it brushes away nicely, the outer layers are quite fragile, and it's actually kind of satisfying. But the fun doesn't last long. Soon you reach a much harder, tightly adherent crust of hard minerals, which in this case is very thick. Removing stuff this hard and clingy mechanically with power tools would certainly end up with damage to healthy metal.
Although calling it that way is quite a stretch. Also, I wouldn't be able to access the internals, and I have to if I want to take this thing apart. So I have to act chemically. Unfortunately, the fast way of dissolving rust is with strong mineral acids. The drawback is that they also slowly attack the underlying metal. This is known as pickling and is usually used to remove thick scale from raw stock, where a bit of metal loss is not a big deal.
But in my case, there's more scale than metal in many areas, and I just can't afford losing more.
So there are safer procedures that practically leave the metal untouched, but unfortunately they are painfully slow. Even the quickest of them is over 20 times slower than mineral acids. But I really haven't got a choice, so at this point I need to figure out which one to use.
In my previous videos I've used satisfactorily both citric and oxalic acids, but nothing I've ever shown was nearly as badly corroded as these. Also, they both have drawbacks. Oxalic leaves behind a clingy greenish residue, while citric acid caused some stress corrosion cracking failures in leaf springs in the past. So this time I want to try either a different homemade recipe or a commercial product. The homemade remedy is based on something called disodium EDTA. It's a white powder which I'm dissolving in water at a concentration of 5%. In any of these recipes you need a surfactant to make sure the active ingredient can properly wet the surfaces. Dish soap, which is not a soap by the way, is a common choice. The obtained solution is just mildly acidic at a pH of about 4. I tested it on the handle portion of the gun and I was quite encouraged by the fact that after 6 hours it had reached bare metal in some areas. It also doesn't seem to leave any residue behind, which is nice. Just for comparison, I used oxalic acid on the magazine well, and you can clearly see what I mean by greenish clingy residue. Finally, let's test a commercial product. This is Evaporust, one of the most famous gentle, non-phosphatizing rust removers. It promises incredible performance with zero damage to metal, no residue and no health risks. Unfortunately, it's very expensive. I paid this tiny 1 litre bottle over €20. For comparison, that's enough to make 15 litres of EDTA solution and about 30 litres of the citric acid one. It is true that by buying larger quantities you get better prices, but as you'll see only to an extent. But let's see how effective and quick it is in our specific case. Unfortunately, I can't really soak much in 1 litre of fluid, so I tried that on the barrel with this very professional setup. At this point the barrel had spent exactly 19 hours in the product, and at first sight it looks like it really improved. However, upon close inspection, it doesn't really look like it evaporates rust as they say. I filmed an in-depth comparison of various derusting methods that I'm uploading to my second channel, but I can already tell you this is still faster than any of the homemade recipes I tried.
The problem is cost. See, in order for this product to be effective, the part must be completely submerged. You can't simply brush it on.
Not only that, but 1 litre of solution can only absorb up to 60 grams of rust, and that's stated by the manufacturer, so it's probably optimistic. Just to put things into perspective, the rust that came off by brushing earlier weighted 150 grams, so at the very least 2.5 litres worth of solution.
Realistically, I needed at least 20 litres of product, which was already turning this video quite expensive to make, not to mention the work hours required. So I really want to thank my supporters on Patreon for helping me out, but sadly in this case that wouldn't have been enough. I was close to giving up at this point, but luckily I found a brand that was willing to help me out with this rather desperate project, and I have to thank them for that.
That brand is World of Tanks, which is sponsoring this video. It's a free-to-play multiplayer PC game focused on player versus player tank warfare. I like that it's quite relevant to my channel since it features practically every armored vehicle in existence from the interwar period down to the Cold War, which is the same time frame where the guns I restore come from. For example, the crew of M4 Sherman tanks, of which you can find every variant in the game, had 5 M3 guns identical to the one I'm working on. In my opinion, the developers also did a great job at giving the game an enjoyable arcade feeling, but without missing out on gun and armor realism. The attention given to ballistics is actually remarkable. So try it for free at the link in the description, and using the invite code COMBAT, every new player will get a Cromwell B British medium tank, 250,000 credits, 7 days of premium account, and 3 rental tanks for 10 battles each. Anyway, while I waited for the jugs to arrive, I decided not to waste time and do a first rust dissolving soak in a 5% solution of disodium EDTA. It takes about 3 times as long as Evaporust to get the same effect though. On the bright side, it remains crystal clear during the process and goes through the same shades of color as autumn leaves. On the not so bright side, once it reaches the red stage it starts stinking pretty badly, and I really have no clue why. Let me know if you do. This time-lapse covered the first 30 hours of treatment, after which the color remained pretty much the same, but the rust kept getting dissolved, so this is what it looked like after 72 hours. The part I'm removing here holds the charging handle mechanism, and it almost fell out on its own. However, we can't go any further this way, and I need to tackle a much bigger problem: barrel removal. See, this is one of the very few instances where barrel removal is actually required for taking a gun apart, so it has to come off. I really have no choice. The problem, however, is that the barrel is screwed into the receiver, and we're talking about a large thread size, completely seized up, and no way to grab and turn the parts properly without destroying the little metal that's left. One thing that I know, however, is that the whole receiver build was based on welding. The actual receiver is made up of 2 stamped sheet metal halves welded together with a long continuous seam, and an internally threaded steel ring is welded to the receiver itself. This means that I'll be allowed to use some heat. So I heated up the outer ring, hoping the expansion would be enough to unscrew the barrel. My hopes were, however, quickly crushed. I tried unscrewing it immediately after heating, applying all sorts of thermal shocks with the hope of causing the outer ring to stretch a bit or smashing the rust particles stuck between the threads, but that just didn't work. On the bright side, I realized that I could get the bolt to open. Luckily, since this is a straight blowback design, I could actually push the bolt open simply by hammering a steel tube against the breech, so that I didn't damage the fixed firing pin that sits at the center of the bolt face. If you know the M3 gun, at this point you should see something is wrong.
Well, a lot of things are wrong here, but I mean there's one part that's completely missing. Write in the comments if you know what it is.
Going back to the barrel, I'll instead have to resort to some extreme measures. The rust in the threads expanded, putting the ring under high circumferential stress. Cutting the ring will relieve some stresses, the friction will drop, and I'll be able to unscrew the barrel. Lucky for me, there are 2 spots where the threads are interrupted, and I'm cutting right through one of them. That way I shouldn't mess with the threads. Now a word of caution. Cutting and rewelding a threaded part is generally a terrible idea, and I'll explain why later, but in this case there really wasn't another option. Considering how damaged the receiver is, I simply couldn't fight friction by applying a larger torque. I used a cold chisel to wedge the cut open, and now unscrewing the barrel is pretty straightforward. Notice again that something is missing here. This will be very important later. For now, let's go on with the field strip. Here come the bolt, the recoil springs and the 2 guide rods, which have the function of guiding both the springs and the bolt itself. But what about this stubby spring? At first glance I thought it was some form of buffer spring, but I couldn't find it on any M3 diagram, so I'm thinking it could be a foreign object. The last part that needs removing now is the wire stock. By now the whole thing is down to a much more manageable size, and I placed all the parts once again into an EDTA derusting bath. Another 72 hours went by, and now the solution has turned to an almost blood red colour. The pH measures between 7 and 8, and it looked like the chemical was exhausted.
At this point I completely ran out of EDTA, and the large supply of evaporust I'd ordered was still on its way.
So I had to switch back to oxalic acid. Now you see what I mean about oxalic leaving a lot of residues behind. It looks lime green now, but that's all I had at the moment. Now, how do I make this look like this? Well, it should be clear at this point that this receiver really had enough, and it's well beyond repair.
Since life is all about setting achievable goals, and being able to fire this thing again was well out of the achievable, I decided that my goal was going to be restoring the bolt movement and trigger function while making a museum display piece out of it.
Patching every hole on these not only would take about as long as building it from scratch, but it would probably look awful as well because of the different texture of the new parts compared to the old ones. So I began by grinding away any sharp edge that could injure whoever will handle these, and then I need to make sure it doesn't crumble apart on its own, and for that I'll need some welding. The most important weld is the one on the threaded end of the receiver that'll accept the barrel, and is also the one that worries me the most.
The problem is that once the weld is done, thermal contraction of the heat affected zone will try to shrink the circle, which could make it impossible to screw the barrel back in again.
To counteract that, I slightly opened the gap with a cold chisel before preparing the edges for welding. Still, this is not something you do normally, but I'm sure you realize this whole project is well out of the norm. Now, time to weld with my very steady hands. I could have used TIG to weld these back together, but I'm old school, much older than my age actually, so I'm using an oxyacetylene torch, not for any particular reason though. Just notice that this is actual welding, not brazing or soldering. I'm actually melting the base metal, and the filler rod is steel as well. Not the prettiest of welds, but it should be fine. I also welded the magazine well back together because that was a major weak spot. By now the bolt and barrel are practically rust free, so I gave them a good scratch with some Scotch-Brite and we're down to bare metal. On those two parts I simply applied some copper selenide cold blue. You know, I do all sorts of proper bluing, but on parts this rough there's honestly no point. The drawbacks of cold blue are that it's not very wear resistant and that the colour can turn out not uniform. In this case, the substrate is far from uniform on its own and is so rough that there's no way the blue will get worn off the surface. One thing I still haven't shown you is the bore, so here I'm giving it a good brush and this is what it looks like. Not much is left of the rifling, although you can still tell it was there. It doesn't look nearly as bad as the outside, but still enough material got lost that now I can almost push a bullet down the bore with my bare hands, which should definitely not be the case.
This barrel is way beyond recovery, just like the receiver and practically everything else. But again, my goal now is simply to put this thing back together as a display piece and being able to rack and release the bolt.
This is the receiver, finally rust free. What you're looking at is bare metal that's seeing the light of day for the first time after 70 years. However, I can't just leave it bare like this, not only because it would look awful, but also because it would get rusty again quite quickly. Since there's not really much harm I can do to an item in this condition, I decided to try my homemade parkerizing process that I've been developing recently. In fact, M3s were originally parkerized. It's still far from perfect, but we're getting there and I got some useful insights. In the meanwhile, I welded the charging handle back on since the original had gone completely corroded away, and with some oil I finally started getting some movement of the charging handle. As you might have guessed, the M3 employed a unique charging mechanism instead of the usual bolt handle that was actuated through the use of this lever. This way, no charging handle slot was required, and the dust cover would completely seal off the gun inside from dirt and grime. However, the crank mechanism turned out not to be very reliable and was later gotten rid of with the M3A1. With the new handle welded on and a bit of oil, I was finally able to get some movement. The main spring was still working fine, and I thought I'd gotten away with it until I saw this tiny spring. One of its two arms is missing, so I'll have to replace it. Time to call up a new spring. There you go, back in business, sort of. Okay, sounds like we're ready for reassembly, but in reality we're not.
Remember when I said earlier that something was wrong with the bolt assembly? This gun is missing the two plates that seal off the bolt assembly. The bolt wasn't supposed to come out like that, but the whole assembly, including springs and guide rods, should have come into a self-contained unit. Neither the front plate nor the bottom one, however, seemed to be present. Also, they were rather thick plates. I don't think they could have simply rusted away.
If that was the case, at least for the front one, we would have found a lot more corrosion products between the bolt face and the breech. So I think that those two parts were instead entirely missing. At the same time, the stubby spring that came out, and that I haven't been able to find on any cutaways or diagrams, seems to be a foreign part.
The plates are not strictly necessary for functioning, but it's practically impossible to reassemble the gun without them. So I can speculate that somebody, having lost the plates for whatever reason, used that large spring, coming from somewhere else, to aid in putting the thing back together, although this is just speculation.
In any case, I need those plates. I have available a lot of gun spare parts, but not for this specific one. The M3 was conceived from the beginning as a cheap disposable firearm, so instead of repairing a malfunctioning one, you'd simply throw it away and get a new one.
Kind of like what we do with practically anything these days.
This meant that there really was no spare parts supply chain, and none of my suppliers had what I needed. Turns out I'll have to embarrass myself once again with my metalworking skills. Keep in mind I'm not making an exact copy of the originals, I'm instead just doing the bare minimum that'll allow the bolt to move properly. Remember, I'm not trying to make this thing shoot again, I just want it to be a display item for a museum. There you go, not the prettiest, by any means, but at least it moves. This is how it looked like at the beginning. Before leaving you, I want to give a final thanks to World of Tanks for sponsoring and making this video possible. Play the game for free by following the link in the description below and use code COMBAT to get a large bonus pack. Once again, a huge thanks goes to my patrons, which as usual are all listed here. Thank you all for watching, subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I'll see you next time. Bye.